The sun was setting over Los Angeles when Simone Johnson, the 22-year-old daughter of Hollywood superstar Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, was driving home from her evening workout. Her black Mercedes SUV cruised smoothly along Sunset Boulevard, the music playing softly through the speakers as she thought about her upcoming wrestling training session the next morning. The peaceful evening drive came to an abrupt halt when red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Simone checked her speedometer. She hadn't been speeding. Following proper protocol, she pulled over to the right side of the road, turned off her music, and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Officer James Keller, a 15-year veteran of the LAPD, approached her vehicle with his hand resting on his holstered weapon. Even before reaching her window, his demeanor seemed hostile. Standing 6'2" with cold blue eyes and a permanent scowl, Officer Keller had developed a reputation in the community that few wanted to discuss openly. "License and registration," he barked, not even bothering with the customary greeting. His flashlight beam hit Simone's face with unnecessary intensity, causing her to squint. "Of course, officer," Simone replied calmly, maintaining her composure despite his aggressive tone. "May I reach for my purse to get my license?" Officer Keller's response was immediate and harsh. "Just hurry up, and don't try anything stupid." As Simone carefully reached for her documents, she noticed Officer Keller's partner, Officer Rodriguez, standing back at their patrol car looking uncomfortable. Something about the situation felt wrong, but Simone remained professional, just as her father had always taught her. "Here you go, sir," she said, handing over her license and registration. Officer Keller snatched them from her hand, his expression changing as he read the name Johnson on her license. "So, you think having a famous daddy means you can drive however you wanted, my see?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Simone's heart began to race, but she kept her voice steady. "No, sir, I wasn't speeding or breaking any traffic laws. May I ask why you pulled me over?" "You made an illegal lane change back there," Officer Keller claimed, though Simone knew this wasn't true. She had been driving carefully, as she always did. "Officer, I'm certain I used my turn signal and changed lanes safely," she responded respectfully. "If you have dashcam footage, I'm happy to review it with you." This seemed to anger Officer Keller further. He leaned into her window, his face inches from hers. "Are you calling me a liar, girl?" Several passers-by had begun to slow down, some even pulling out their phones to record the interaction. Officer Rodriguez shifted nervously at the patrol car, clearly aware that the situation was escalating unnecessarily. "No, sir," Simone replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I'm just trying to understand the situation." Officer Keller's face reddened. "Step out of the vehicle." "May I ask why?" Simone questioned, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone to record the interaction. Officer Keller noticed her movement and his expression darkened. "I said, get out of the car, now." Simone began to comply, reaching for her seatbelt, but before she could even unbuckle it, Officer Keller had yanked her door open. The situation was spinning out of control. "Officer, please," Simone started to say, "I'm cooperating." Without warning, Officer Keller's fist connected with the side of her face, the impact shocking both Simone and the growing crowd of onlookers. Gasps and shouts erupted from the bystanders, and Officer Rodriguez finally started moving forward, calling out, "Keller, stand down." Simone's head spun from the blow, but she managed to press the emergency contact button on her phone. The call went straight to her father's personal security team, who had been trained for situations exactly like this. Blood trickled from a small cut on her lip as Officer Keller roughly grabbed her arm, attempting to drag her from the car. Phones recorded from every angle as the officer continued his assault, seemingly unaware or uncaring about the witnesses documenting his every move. In a matter of minutes, the video of a racist cop assaulting Dwayne, "The Rock" Johnson's daughter would begin spreading across social media like wildfire. And somewhere across town, on a movie set where he was filming his latest action blockbuster, Dwayne Johnson's phone was about to ring with news that would make his blood boil and set in motion a chain of events that would rock the entire Los Angeles Police Department to its core. The sun had fully set now, but the night was just beginning, and Officer James Keller had no idea that his actions would soon bring consequences far beyond anything he could have imagined. News of Simone Johnson's assault spread faster than wildfire across Los Angeles. Within 20 minutes of the incident, Dwayne Johnson was already speeding through the city streets in his black Ford Raptor, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. His personal security team followed close behind in two separate vehicles. At the scene of the incident, the situation had become increasingly tense. A crowd of nearly 100 people had gathered, their phones recording every moment as Officer Keller continued his power trip. Simone sat handcuffed in the back of the police car, her face swelling from the punch, while Officer Rodriguez argued with his partner. "This is completely out of line, Keller," Rodriguez shouted, finally finding his courage. "You just assaulted an unarmed civilian on camera. What were you thinking?" Keller's face was red with rage as he turned to face his partner. "Stay out of this, Rodriguez." She was resisting arrest. "Resisting what arrest?" Rodriguez fired back. She was sitting in her car, following instructions. The dash cam and body cams caught everything. The crowd's angry murmurs grew louder. Several people had already recognized Simone, and social media was exploding with videos of the incident. #JusticeForSimone was trending, and major news networks were picking up the story. Meanwhile, in his truck, Dwayne Johnson received a call from his lawyer, Benjamin Hayes, one of Los Angeles' top criminal defense attorneys. "Dwayne, I've already contacted Internal Affairs," Hayes informed him. "Officer Keller has a history. 6 complaints of excessive force in the past 3 years, all involving minorities. This isn't his first rodeo, but it's going to be his last." The Rock's jaw clenched as he listened. "Is Simone okay?" "She's being held at the Western Division Station. They're charging her with resisting arrest and assaulting an officer, but it's nonsense. We have multiple video angles showing she never raised a hand against him." As Johnson neared the police station, his phone exploded with calls from celebrity friends, media outlets, and even the mayor of Los Angeles. The incident was quickly becoming a national story. Inside the police station, Officer Keller strutted around like he owned the place, seemingly oblivious to the storm he had created. Several of his fellow officers watched him with disgust, having already seen the viral videos of his attack on Simone. Captain Sarah Martinez, the station commander, sat in her office reviewing the footage with growing horror. She had always suspected Keller was a problem, but now she had irrefutable proof. As she watched the video for the third time, her office door burst open. "Captain, Dwayne Johnson is here," an officer announced, his voice shaking slightly. The entire station fell silent as The Rock walked in, his 6'5" frame filling the doorway. Despite his anger, his voice was controlled and steady as he spoke to the desk sergeant. "I'm here for my daughter," he said, his eyes scanning the room until they fell on Officer Keller. The racist cop's arrogant demeanor suddenly faltered as he found himself face to face with the consequences of his actions. The man standing before him wasn't just a Hollywood star, he was an enraged father whose child had been assaulted. Captain Martinez quickly emerged from her office. "Mr. Johnson, please come with me. We're releasing your daughter immediately, and I want you to know that Officer Keller has been suspended pending investigation." As they walked to the holding area, Keller made the mistake of opening his mouth. She was resisting. Before he could finish, Dwayne spun around, his eyes blazing with controlled fury. The entire room held its breath, expecting The Rock to live up to his action hero image and lay out the corrupt cop with one punch. Instead, Johnson spoke in a quiet, deadly serious tone that was somehow more intimidating than any shouting could have been. "Officer Keller, you just assaulted my little girl on camera because of the color of her skin. But I'm not going to give you what you want. You won't make me lose control. Instead, I'm going to make sure you never wear that badge again, and that everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are." The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Officer Keller's face drained of color as he realized that this situation was far beyond anything he could handle. He had picked the wrong target, and now his entire world was about to come crashing down. As Simone was released from holding and rushed into her father's arms, the news helicopters circled overhead, and protesters began gathering outside the station. This was only the beginning, and Officer James Keller's nightmare was about to get much, much worse. The morning after Simone's assault, Los Angeles woke up to chaos. Thousands of protesters surrounded the Western Division police station, holding signs that read "Justice for Simone" and "End Police Brutality." News vans lined the streets as reporters from every major network covered the story that had captivated the nation. Inside his luxury Beverly Hills mansion, Dwayne Johnson sat with his daughter and their legal team, reviewing the mountain of evidence against Officer Keller. Simon's face was still swollen, but her spirit remained unbroken. "Look at this," Benjamin Hayes, their lawyer, said as he scrolled through his tablet. "3 more victims of Keller have come forward overnight, all young women of color, all claiming similar experiences of harassment and violence." Simone leaned forward, wincing slightly from the pain. "We need to help them too, Dad. This isn't just about me anymore." The Rock nodded, his expression serious. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since the incident. Fellow wrestlers, Hollywood stars, and civil rights leaders had all reached out, offering their support and resources. Meanwhile, at Officer Keller's small apartment across town, the disgraced cop was facing his own crisis. News cameras camped outside his building, and his social media accounts were flooded with thousands of angry messages. His wife had taken their kids and left for her mother's house, unable to handle the pressure and shame. Keller's phone rang. It was the police union representative. "James, I'm going to be straight with you," the rep said grimly. "We can't defend this one. The evidence is overwhelming, and the publicity is too intense. You're on your own." As Keller processed this betrayal, his television showed live coverage of a press conference at City Hall. The mayor stood at the podium, flanked by the police chief and several city council members. "The city of Los Angeles condemns in the strongest possible terms the actions of Officer James Keller," the mayor declared. "We are launching a full investigation not only into this incident but into Officer Keller's entire service record. Additionally, we are implementing immediate reforms in our police training and oversight procedures." Back at the Johnson household, Dwayne received an unexpected call from Officer Rodriguez, Keller's former partner. "Mr. Johnson," Rodriguez said, his voice heavy with emotion, "I want to testify against Keller. I should have stopped him sooner, and I'm sorry for that, but I have documentation of other incidents he's been involved in, things that were covered up." This was the break they needed. The Rock immediately connected Rodriguez with their legal team, who began preparing statements and gathering evidence. By afternoon, the story had taken another turn. Someone had leaked Keller's personnel file to the media. It revealed a disturbing pattern: 12 complaints of excessive force, all mysteriously dismissed. 4 incidents of racial profiling, buried in bureaucracy. 2 domestic disturbance calls to his home address, swept under the rug. The police chief called an emergency meeting with his command staff. The department's reputation was in tatters, and they needed to act fast. As they discussed damage control, a junior officer burst into the room. "Chief, you need to see this," he said, holding up his phone. The screen showed a new viral video dashboard camera footage from another traffic stop 6 months ago. It showed Keller assaulting another young woman of color, almost identical to what he did to Simone. The timestamp proved it had happened, and the department had done nothing. Across town, Officer Keller sat alone in his apartment, watching his world crumble. His phone rang again. This time it was Internal Affairs. "Officer Keller, we need you to come in immediately," the investigator said coldly, "and bring your badge and gun." As the sun began to set on this tumultuous day, Dwayne Johnson and Simone appeared together on a national news broadcast. They spoke not of revenge, but of change. Not of hatred, but of hope for reform. "What happened to me was terrible," Simone said, her voice strong despite her injuries. "But it happens to people without famous parents every day. We're going to use our platform to fight for them too." The Rock looked at his daughter with pride. They had chosen not to respond with violence, but with something much more powerful: justice through the system, reform through publicity, and change through unity. As night fell over Los Angeles, Officer Keller's reign of terror was ending, but the movement for police accountability was just beginning. And tomorrow would bring even more revelations that would shake the department to its core. As dawn broke over Los Angeles on the 3rd day of the scandal, the city was rocked by explosive new developments. Internal Affairs investigators had spent the night going through Officer Keller's work laptop, discovering a trove of racist emails and text messages exchanged with other officers. At the Western Division Station, Captain Martinez called an emergency meeting. "We've identified 8 other officers involved in Keller's discriminatory activities," she announced to her stunned staff. "This goes deeper than we thought." Meanwhile, Dwayne Johnson sat in his home gym, unable to sleep. Though he hadn't touched a weight that morning, sweat dripped down his face as he watched the mounting evidence against Keller play out on the news. His phone buzzed. It was Benjamin Hayes. "Dwayne, we got something big," the lawyer said urgently. "A former police dispatcher just came forward. She has recordings of Keller bragging about targeting minorities during his shifts. He called it his personal cleanup operation." The Rock's fists clenched. Each new revelation made his blood boil, but he remained focused on their legal strategy. They weren't just going after Keller anymore, they were exposing an entire system of corruption. Across town, Officer Keller faced his own personal nightmare. As he left his apartment to meet with internal affairs, protesters blocked his path. Someone had leaked his address online. The crowd's angry chants filled the air as police escorts tried to clear a path for their disgraced colleague. Inside the Internal Affairs office, Keller sat across from investigators, his arrogance finally cracking under pressure. The evidence against him was overwhelming. "We have testimony from 17 officers," the lead investigator said, dropping a thick file on the table. "They're all talking, Keller. Your little network is falling apart." Keller's face turned pale. "I want my union rep," he stammered. "Your union has withdrawn all support," the investigator replied coldly. "You're done, Keller. The only question is how many others you're taking down with you." At that moment, in a downtown law office, Officer Rodriguez was giving his official statement. He described years of witnessing Keller's brutal behavior, the department's failure to act, and the subtle threats that kept others silent. "He had dirt on everyone," Rodriguez explained, his voice shaking. "That's how he kept getting away with it. But what he did to Ms. Johnson, that was his biggest mistake. He thought he was untouchable." The afternoon brought another bombshell. A group of senior officers came forward, admitting they had helped cover up Keller's previous incidents. The scandal was now threatening to bring down half the department's command structure. At City Hall, the mayor held another press conference. "We are announcing the formation of an independent oversight committee," he declared. "Mr. Johnson has agreed to serve as an advisory member, along with civil rights leaders and community activists." Simone Johnson, despite her injuries, attended a peaceful rally organized by police reform advocates. Her presence sent a powerful message. This wasn't about revenge, but about changing a broken system. "My father taught me that real strength isn't about throwing punches," she told the crowd. "It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Back at Internal Affairs, Keller finally broke. After hours of questioning, he began naming names, revealing a network of corrupt officers who had enabled his behavior for years. His confession would lead to the largest purge of corrupt officers in LAPD history. As evening approached, Dwayne Johnson received an unexpected visitor, Officer Keller's wife, Sarah. She had come to apologize for her husband's actions. "I knew what he was," she said through tears. "I should have spoken up sooner. Maybe I could have prevented what happened to your daughter." The Rock listened with compassion, understanding that Keller's toxic behavior had created many victims over the years. "What matters now is that the truth is coming out," he told her. "Real change is finally happening." At the end of this momentous day, Captain Martinez stood in her office, looking at the photos of all the officers implicated in the scandal. The department would never be the same, but maybe that was exactly what it needed. As night fell over Los Angeles, Officer Keller sat alone in a holding cell, his badge and gun confiscated, his career in ruins. He had finally learned the hardest lesson of all, that no one, no matter how powerful they think they are, is above justice. The story was far from over, but one thing was clear. The day Officer Keller decided to punch Dwayne Johnson's daughter would be remembered as the day that changed everything. The fourth day of the scandal brought a series of stunning developments that shook the Los Angeles Police Department to its core. Early morning raids across the city resulted in the arrests of 12 officers connected to Keller's corrupt network. FBI agents working alongside. At police headquarters, Chief Wilson faced a barrage of questions from the press. The revelation that over 24 officers had been involved in covering up Keller's crimes had destroyed public trust in the department. "We're cleaning house," the chief announced grimly. "Every officer, every supervisor who knew about these crimes and stayed silent will be held accountable." Meanwhile, Officer Keller sat in the county jail, a far cry from his usual position of authority. His fellow inmates, many of whom he had arrested over the years, watched him with cold satisfaction. Word had spread about who he was and what he had done. Dwayne Johnson was meeting with civil rights attorneys and community leaders in his home theater room, which had been converted into a command center for their reform campaign. Maps of Los Angeles covered the walls, marking locations of previous police brutality incidents. "We've identified a pattern," Benjamin Hayes explained, pointing to clusters of red pins. Keller and his associates specifically targeted certain neighborhoods, profiling young people of color during their patrols. Simone, her bruises now fading to yellow, studied the maps intently. "Each of these pins represents someone who was afraid to speak up," she said quietly. "Until now." Across town, Sarah Keller was packing up her house. Her husband's frozen assets and mounting legal bills had left her no choice but to sell. As she boxed up family photos, she found a hidden folder in James's home office. Inside were photographs, trophy pictures he had taken of his victims after violent arrests. With hands shaking, she picked up her phone and called Benjamin Hayes. At the district attorney's office, prosecutors were building their case against Keller and his co-conspirators. The evidence was overwhelming: hundreds of illegal arrests, falsified reports, and countless civil rights violations. "We're looking at federal charges," the lead prosecutor told her team. "Civil rights violations, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. Keller's going away for a long time." Back at the Johnson residence, Dwayne received an unexpected call from the Attorney General's office. The case had caught national attention, and they wanted to use it as a blueprint for police reform across the country. "Your daughter's incident could be the catalyst for real change," the Attorney General said. "We want to work with you on national legislation." The Rock looked at Simone, who nodded firmly. Their fight for justice had grown far beyond their personal situation. Meanwhile, Officer Rodriguez was working with reform advocates, helping identify other corrupt officers who hadn't yet been caught. His testimony had opened the floodgates, with more whistleblowers coming forward every day. "It's like a cancer," he explained to investigators. Keller was just one symptom of a much bigger disease in the department. At the county jail, Keller received more bad news. His former colleagues, facing lengthy sentences themselves, had started making deals. Each new confession implicated him in more crimes, more cover-ups, more acts of racism and brutality. That afternoon, surveillance footage emerged from the jail showing Keller breaking down in his cell, the reality of his situation finally hitting him. The man who had terrorized so many was now facing the consequences of his actions. In downtown Los Angeles, protesters continued their peaceful demonstrations, but the mood had shifted from anger to determination. Signs reading "Justice for Simone" were joined by calls for systematic change and police accountability. Dwayne Johnson addressed the crowd, his powerful voice carrying across the square. "What happened to my daughter was terrible, but it's brought to light something even more terrible: a system that protected bad cops and punished good ones for speaking up. That ends now." As evening fell, Captain Martinez sat in her office, reviewing applications for new diversity training programs. The department would need to be rebuilt from the ground up, with new policies, new oversight, and a new commitment to serving all communities equally. The day ended with a small victory. Sarah Keller's evidence had led to 3 more arrests, including a senior supervisor who had helped cover up her husband's crimes for years. In his jail cell, Officer Keller lay awake, haunted by the faces of his victims. His decision to assault Simone Johnson hadn't just ended his career. It had exposed decades of corruption and sparked a revolution in policing that would echo across the nation. The next day would bring even more revelations, as the full scope of the scandal continued to unfold. Day 5 of the scandal brought unexpected allies and shocking confessions. The morning began with a surprise press conference where 20 retired LAPD officers stood together to publicly apologize for staying silent about Keller's behavior during their service years. At the federal courthouse, prosecutors were preparing for what would become one of the largest police corruption trials in American history. Evidence rooms were filled with boxes of documents, hard drives, and body camera footage that painted a disturbing picture of systematic abuse. "We've uncovered a pattern going back 15 years, announced federal prosecutor Maria Santos. Officer Keller wasn't just a bad cop. He was training others to follow his example." In his private gym, Dwayne Johnson was on a video call with civil rights leaders from across the country. The Rock's massive frame filled the screen as he listened to their stories and strategies. My daughter's case opened the door, he told them, but we're going to make sure it stays open until every corrupt officer is exposed. Meanwhile, Simone Johnson was making her own impact. She sat with a group of young women who had previously been victimized by Keller and his associates. Their stories were heartbreaking, but their strength was inspiring. "We're not victims anymore," Simone told them. "We're survivors, and we're going to change things." At the county jail, Officer Keller received his first visitors, 2 FBI agents with a plea deal. They laid out his options: cooperate fully and receive a reduced sentence, or face the maximum penalty for each of his crimes. "We have a signed confession from your former sergeant," one agent said. "He claims you ran an unofficial training program teaching new officers how to harass minorities without getting caught." Keller's face turned ashen. His carefully constructed world was crumbling faster than he could process. Across town, Benjamin Hayes was meeting with a surprise witness, a former police academy instructor who claimed Keller had been problematic even during training. "He showed signs back then," the instructor explained, "but the system was designed to ignore red flags if the recruit could pass the physical tests." At police headquarters, newly appointed internal affairs investigators were going through years of civilian complaints. Boxes of previously dismissed reports were being reopened, each one revealing patterns of abuse that had been ignored. Captain Martinez stood before her remaining officers, those who hadn't been implicated in the scandal. "We're implementing new policies effective immediately," she announced. "Every complaint will be investigated. Every body camera will be reviewed. The old system of protecting bad officers is over." In a downtown law office, Officer Rodriguez was working with reform advocates to develop new training programs. His first-hand experience with Keller's corruption made him valuable in identifying where the system had failed. "It wasn't just about race," he explained. "It was about power." Keller taught officers that the badge made them untouchable. The afternoon brought another bombshell. Sarah Keller, still cooperating with investigators, discovered a hidden storage unit rented under her husband's name. Inside were files documenting years of illegal activities, not just his own, but those of officers across multiple precincts. Dwayne Johnson received the news while meeting with state legislators. "This isn't just about punishing bad cops anymore," he told them. "We need to change the entire culture that allowed them to thrive." At the jail, Keller finally broke down and agreed to cooperate. His confession, recorded over several hours, revealed a network of corruption that went beyond anything investigators had imagined. "He named names we weren't even investigating," one FBI agent reported. "High-ranking officers, politicians, judges, people who helped cover up his crimes for years." As evening approached, Simone Johnson spoke at a community meeting in one of the neighborhoods most affected by police brutality. Her presence brought both tears and hope to residents who had suffered in silence for years. "My father taught me that real strength isn't about physical power," she told them. "It's about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost." The day ended with a candlelight vigil outside the police station where Keller had worked. Hundreds gathered, holding signs with the names of his victims, names that would no longer be forgotten or ignored. In his cell, Officer Keller watched the news coverage of the vigil on a small TV. The man who had once terrorized the streets of Los Angeles now sat alone, his power gone, his legacy one of shame rather than fear. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more arrests, and more steps toward lasting change. The system that had protected corrupt officers for so long was finally being dismantled, one piece at a time. Day 6 of the scandal brought the biggest shockwaves yet. Early morning raids by FBI agents targeted not just police officers, but judges, city officials, and prominent business leaders who had helped cover up police brutality cases for years. In a dramatic scene at City Hall, federal agents led away 2 senior council members in handcuffs. They had been caught on tape discussing payoffs to keep Keller's victims quiet. Dwayne Johnson watched the morning news coverage from his home office, his daughter Simone beside him. "It goes all the way to the top," he said quietly. "This is bigger than we ever imagined." At the federal courthouse, prosecutors were processing a flood of new evidence. Officer Keller's confession had opened up leads that exposed a vast network of corruption. "We've uncovered offshore accounts," announced lead investigator Sarah Chen. "Money that was used to silence victims, pay off witnesses, and keep corrupt officers protected." Meanwhile, at the county jail, Keller was being moved to protective custody. His former colleagues, now his fellow inmates, had made it clear he wasn't safe in the general population. "How does it feel?" a guard asked him during the transfer. "Being on the other side of these bars?" Keller said nothing, but his haunted expression spoke volumes. The man who had terrorized so many now lived in constant fear himself. Across town, Benjamin Hayes was meeting with a group of former police officers who had been forced out of the department years ago for trying to report Keller's behavior. "They destroyed our careers," one ex-officer explained, fighting back tears. "But now everyone knows we were telling the truth." At police headquarters, the new reform task force, led by Captain Martinez and Officer Rodriguez, was implementing sweeping changes. Every officer would now wear body cameras that couldn't be turned off. Every complaint would be investigated by an independent board. "The old system is dead," Martinez declared to her officers. "Either adapt to the new way or find another job." Simone Johnson spent the afternoon testifying before a state Senate committee about her experience. Her powerful words moved many to tears. "I was lucky," she said. "I had resources and a famous father. But what about all the other victims who didn't? Who speaks for them?" The Rock himself was meeting with police academy officials, helping design new training programs that emphasize de-escalation and community service over force and intimidation. "We're not just changing policies," he told them, "we're changing the entire culture of policing." Late in the afternoon, Sarah Keller made her most shocking revelation yet. She provided investigators with a recorded conversation between her husband and several high-ranking officials, discussing how to handle officers who tried to report corruption. "They called it taking out the trash," she explained to prosecutors. "But the trash was the good cops who tried to stop the abuse." At the jail, Keller received more bad news. His legal team had quit after discovering he had lied to them about crucial details. He would now face trial with a public defender. The evening brought a massive rally in downtown Los Angeles. Thousands gathered to support police reform, including many current and former officers who wanted to see their profession cleaned up. Dwayne Johnson addressed the crowd, his powerful voice carrying across the square. "This isn't about revenge," he declared. "It's about making sure no other father has to see his child brutalized by those sworn to protect and serve." In her hospital room, one of Keller's previous victims watched the coverage on TV. She had been too afraid to come forward before, but now she felt hope for the first time in years. "If they can take down Keller," she told her nurse, "maybe there's justice after all." The day ended with another round of arrests. 3 more judges were taken into custody, accused of dismissing cases against corrupt officers in exchange for bribes. In his protective custody cell, Keller sat alone, writing what appeared to be a confession. Pages and pages of names, dates, and crimes. A career built on brutality and racism, finally exposed to the light. Outside the jail, protesters held a candlelight vigil, but unlike previous nights, they weren't angry anymore. There was a sense of hope, of change finally coming to a system that had been broken for too long. Tomorrow would bring more revelations, more arrests, more steps toward justice. But tonight, for the first time since the scandal began, it felt like the good guys were winning. The system that had protected corrupt officers for so long was crumbling, and from its ashes, something better would rise. 1 month after Officer Keller's assault on Simone Johnson, Los Angeles gathered to witness the final chapter of this historic case. The federal courthouse was packed as Judge Maria Rodriguez prepared to deliver the verdict that would send shockwaves through law enforcement nationwide. Officer James Keller sat at the defendant's table, a shell of his former self. His police uniform was replaced by an orange jumpsuit, his once proud posture now slumped in defeat. Behind him, row after row of seats were filled with his victims and their families, including Dwayne Johnson and Simone. "In my 30 years on the bench," Judge Rodriguez began, "I had never seen such a devastating abuse of power and public trust." The courtroom fell silent as she read the verdict, his sentence, 30 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. But the judge wasn't finished. "This case has exposed not just one corrupt officer, but an entire system that enabled and protected him. Therefore, I am ordering a complete federal oversight of the Los Angeles Police Department for the next 5 years." Outside the courthouse, thousands had gathered to hear the verdict. When it was announced, Cheers erupted across the crowd. Signs reading "Justice Served" and "Change Starts Now" waved in the afternoon sun. At police headquarters, the changes were already visible. Captain Martinez, now promoted to deputy chief, was implementing new training programs developed with input from community leaders and civil rights experts. "Today marks the end of the old way," she announced to her officers, "and the beginning of true community policing." Dwayne Johnson stood at the courthouse steps, addressing the media with Simone by his side. "This verdict isn't just about punishment," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "It's about transformation, about making sure what happened to my daughter never happens to anyone else's child." In total, the investigation had led to the conviction of 43 police officers, 6 judges, and 12 city officials. The corrupt network that had protected bad cops for decades was finally dismantled. Simone Johnson had become a symbol of change, but she wanted to be more than that. She announced the creation of the Johnson Justice Initiative, a foundation dedicated to supporting victims of police brutality and promoting law enforcement reform. "We're going to continue this fight," she declared. "Not just in Los Angeles, but across the country. Every city, every department that needs change, will be there." Officer Rodriguez, who had testified against his former partner, was now leading the department's new Internal Affairs Division. His first act was to establish an anonymous reporting system for officers to safely report misconduct. "The blue wall of silence is over," he told his team. "From now on, good cops protect good cops, and bad cops face justice." Sarah Keller, who had helped expose her husband's crimes, started working with police reform advocates. Her insider knowledge proved invaluable in identifying warning signs of corruption in other departments. In his prison cell, Officer Keller began writing a detailed confession, documenting every abuse of power, every act of racism, every moment that led to his downfall. The manuscript would later be used to train future officers on what not to become. The day ended with a ceremony at City Hall. The mayor signed into law the most comprehensive police reform package in the city's history, named the Simone Johnson Act. Its provisions included mandatory body cameras, civilian oversight boards, and strict penalties for officers who abused their power. Dwayne Johnson watched the signing with pride, his arm around his daughter. What had started as a terrible act of violence had transformed into a movement for real change. "Sometimes the biggest changes come from the darkest moments," he told the assembled crowd. "Today, we've proven that justice is stronger than corruption, that truth is more powerful than fear." As the sun set over Los Angeles, police stations across the city began implementing the new reforms. Officers attended mandatory training sessions, learning de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity. The story of Officer Keller and Simone Johnson would be taught in police academies as a turning point. The moment when one act of racism led to the exposure and destruction of an entire corrupt system. In the end, Keller's attempt to assert his power through violence had achieved the opposite of what he intended. Instead of silencing another victim, he had given voice to thousands. Instead of protecting a corrupt system, he had helped destroy it. As night fell over the city, a new era of policing was beginning. The badge would no longer be a shield for racism and brutality, but a symbol of protection and service for all communities. The Rock had indeed destroyed Keller, not with his fists, but with justice.